stop Mac hacks in their tracks. We decided to get clever with some of our titles here. We'll jump right into it. Your speakers today are myself, Wes Hutcherson, and then you also have Stuart as well. I'd like to say that he is definitely the technical guru that will be speaking. I'm director of product marketing. I've been in cybersecurity and network infrastructure, stuff like that for almost 16 years. I like to say I'm technical enough to be dangerous, but the dangerous one is Stuart. He'll introduce himself and talk a little bit about his macOS accolades here.
You give me too much credit. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stuart Ashenbrenner. I am a researcher here at Huntress, both focusing on macOS in general. So whether that's security research or just general macOS research, I've worked on a few open source projects over the years. One called Aftermath, but I love talking about macOS. That's basically my entire technical history is on the macOS ecosystem and Apple devices in general. So I'm super excited. I'm glad to be alongside you, Wes.
Thanks. So we're going to check out a poll real quick. We like to bust Mac myths. There's tons of them out there. Just interested as to what y'all see or what y'all see from a myth standpoint as to what's actually true. We'll reference some of these throughout the webcast. One thing we're not going to do in this webcast is just bore you to death with a bunch of statistics and stuff. We're going to show you some just to kind of set up some cool attacks that Stuart's going to go through. We're going to show some real world attacks, how macOS was used and some of the components of it to actually achieve their objectives. We're going to show you quite a few of those. It should be really interesting. We hope to keep you engaged here. But before we do that, let me just set the stage before we go into a couple of these cool attacks. So just for context, so you can kind of compare your macOS infrastructure or install base compared to what's out there. So macOS is basically second most utilized OS worldwide. I don't think that comes as any surprise. We saw in our research that about anywhere from 20% up to around, we saw up to 30% of business devices are actually running Mac OS out there, and there's no surprise as to why. The superior display and reliability, the system on a chip, all that kind of stuff, and it's different industries are more inclined to adopt it. We've actually seen a 20% year-over-year adoption worldwide for Mac OS, and these are relevant to specific industries. You can see creative art, software development, all that kind of stuff. Mac OS is really applicable to those kinds of industries, for the application ecosystem, ability to code and so forth. But we're going to show a couple of examples of how these are actually attacked here in a second. So Stuart's going to give you a little bit of background on some of the attacks that are actually targeting Mac OS and what we're seeing, and then we're going to flip into a cool example.
Cool, thank you. And you can see here on the slide, there's a lot of different malware families and variants here. And it's going to range everywhere from adware all the way to more advanced nation state, APT type attacks. Over on the left side, we have ad load, common adware, moving into info stealers like Amos or Atomic Stealer or whatever the vernacular is that people are using, and even into some of the more I would say legacy type macOS malware, right? We're talking about Genio, stuff that used to come packaged back in probably the mid 2000s. Used to get it when you'd accidentally download a cleaning software, which we'll talk about more later. And then things like Rust Bucket, which is from Blue Noroff, which is an APT as well. So these cover a large gambit of MITRE attack techniques. You can see about 39 on average that orgs are susceptible to. And we're going to kind of dive into a few of these as well. Of course, I don't want to forget Light Spy. Light Spy is a malware that recently my coworker Alden and I wrote about. You can actually, if you go into the handout section of the webinar, you can actually see some great links and some resources there. So make sure you check those out. And also, as we roll through, if you have any questions, so we can track them, throw them in the Q&A tab, so we can get to those at the end.
All right. So, I was looking at some of the poll respondents here. What was interesting, it was kind of split of which of these macOS, security myths is actually true. Ransomware is a threat to macOS, and macOS threats differ from Windows. it's I'm glad to see the first option, Macs don't get viruses, is relatively low there. You know, it's interesting in our research, Mac OS users were actually specifically polled, and pretty shockingly, 57% of them didn't believe malware, existed on Macs, which was pretty concerning. However, which was in complete opposition to this, 50% of those users had been affected by malware, hacking, or scams. It was really weird. It was the same study, and so something didn't add up there. You can still tell that these, myths are still, throughout, enterprises, with enterprises, and more specifically their users, which kind of lends itself to risky behaviors that are out there. But what we want to do is let's jump into some of the fun stuff. So I'm going to set up Stuart for kind of what happened in this particular attack. So you might see like the adult store petition and be like, "Whoa, what are we about to go through here?" So the to set up Stuart before he goes through this. So there was actually a phishing email crafted. It was actually a spear phishing email crafted that was targeting a prominent C-level at an organization. They knew that they could get into, financial records and so forth if they were able to compromise this person. They actually crafted a spear phishing email based on information they had seen on a public Facebook profile. More specifically, the public Facebook profile, the executive had been showing where his children went to school and all sorts of stuff like that should have been private. So what they did is they crafted the phishing email to say that there was a adult store being that had bought land that was in relatively close proximity to the kid's school. Since his stature in the community was very well respected, would he mind signing this petition to basically keep it from happening? And Stuart's going to take you through what happened here.
Man, Wes, I was hoping we would roll through this and never once address that. And just leave it there. So how this happened. So we talked about a spear phishing email. So with macOS being a different platform than Windows, we have different threats, different ways of attacking it. And some of it is relatively simple and some of it's very novel. And in this case, there was a binary that was actually sent to the user that was masquerading as a PDF. And you can do this with relative ease by just adding a space into the file name. And what happens is macOS then treats that as a binary as opposed to a PDF. You can even have the little PDF icon to even sell it more. So this binary was executed. And interestingly enough, it runs AppleScript, which is also unique to macOS. So AppleScript, which is also called OSA script or OSA script, comes pre-installed on every Mac machine. So if you buy a new MacBook and you open it up, it has it installed, which makes it very interesting and appealing for hackers. So they know it's going to be on the system. If you learn how to write it, which isn't easy, OSA script is actually a pain to write and read. But once you understand it, you can do some very interesting things like simulate password prompts that look almost identical to the ones that Apple gives you in general. So once they started executing AppleScript, downloaded a malicious file, which then opened a reverse shell. It then decided to persist. So on macOS, there's kind of a wide range of ways to persist. This one used a user launch agent. So there's really three primary locations that any programs use to persist. That's in the root directory in a folder called launch daemons or launch agents. And then each user on the device also has a launch agents directory that you can use to persist user items. So this was a user launch agent. It then leveraged a TCC bypass. So TCC stands for transparency, consent, and control. It's like when you might have even noticed it today when you are trying to use your webcam in Chrome or something. It'll say Chrome wants to use your webcam. Do you want to allow it or deny it? And you have that choice. And that is a TCC prompt. And then all get saved into a database. And this is everything from location information to who has access to your desktop and documents, and all the way into if you can have full disk access, so access across the disk to really do almost carte blanche with the system. So over the years, there have been a ton of TCC bypasses and vulnerabilities and 0 days that have been disclosed. And so this actually used a TCC vulnerability, and then also was gathering credentials using the shadow hash data file, which you can basically read if you have the permission, and get user passwords. And then into this was system info discovery, so things like system profiler that can give you the hardware type, software, OS version, and things like that. And then to the last few, right? Gathering data and actually looking for financial data on the system, which is even simpler using grep. You can just grep for financial or password and things like that and grab those off the end system before exfiltrating them. So I know that's a really long story, but I think what I want to segue into is how that really maps out. You saw the MITRE techniques on that page. And this looks very convoluted, but you can kind of follow the arrow around and see the path that the attacker took. And really, it's a great visual and shows how just even using MITRE as a tool to track hacker behavior can really give you insight into what hackers are doing. And I think what we will see in these stories, we'll talk about a few of them, is trends. And so we'll talk about the trend later on. So I think it's important, if not just talking about what the attacker did, but what could have been done to potentially stop it. So if we start with something like a phishing email, you could leverage something like some type of security awareness training, inform users to know what they're clicking on or what not to click on, more importantly. And then moving into something like an EDR, which can look for the execution of AppleScript, looking for persistence items, making sure that things like Gatekeeper are turned on, system integrity protection, and MFA. So lastly, and we'll only talk about this slide this once, but what could a managed EDR do at each stage? So once we get out of the email portion of it and we get to what's happening on the disk, we see things like AppleScript, launch agent creation, and these are things that a managed EDR can catch if they're tapping into the right data. So leveraging Apple's endpoint security framework, you can actually see what processes are doing, and you could see that OSA script is calling something very suspicious and alert on it. As well as if we look into like system discovery, very common commands, especially that info stealers like to use, system profile and the like, you can detect on with a managed EDR.
So we're going to go through a couple more cool stories like that, but let me kind of switch back here as to some of the things. Stuart was talking about some of the risky behaviors that are kind of associated with Mac OS. If you look at the usage of just some of the sort of low-hanging fruit that could be done, the immediate patching, if you notice, for instance, Windows versus Mac OS, pretty distinct difference in immediately patching critical vulnerabilities. Use of AV, tremendously less. There's I think that kind of is correlative to that myth that Macs are more inherently secure than Windows in there. So you see these risky behaviors that basically leave organizations vulnerable to compromise. Now, if we take a look at this, so this actually comes from a study of ethical hackers. So, they have the ethical hacking boundaries put on them. There's about 400 ethical hackers that were actually polled, and they were asked how fast could they find an exploitable endpoint? How fast could they then compromise? Again, going basically through the attack chain that Stuart had talked about. What was pretty concerning was that 61% of these ethical hackers said that they could find an exploitable endpoint in under 15 hours. Then the compromise in the endpoint, actually, there was a larger percentage that could do it in under 15 hours and gain access to target, collect, and exfiltrate. It actually accelerates from there. So, really, you're going to hear me talk a little bit about, time is of the essence here. These attackers move very, very quickly. You saw on the previous one, the attacker was able to accomplish the objectives within, a couple of days there. We're going to show one here where it all happens within 24 hours. So that kind of sets up that one of the reasons for this is the macOS threats are built differently. They're a bit unique in nature. And Stuart's going to talk a little bit about these and then show you how an attack was actually, or some of these unique threats were actually used in a real world example.
So when we look at macOS threats, they very much differ depending on your business. So small, medium-sized businesses and you go up to large enterprises, say large financial institutions, the larger ones you're going to see very likely be targeted more by 0 days and Trojans looking for unpatched vulnerabilities, nation state attacks, and things like that. However, when you start looking when you start kind of walking down towards the SMB size of business, we see a lot of things like pups. That's fake cleaning software, software that you think you're getting value of. Turns out it is actually packaged with something like adware. And the two go hand in hand a lot. So, adware being a pop up that you click on, kind of browser hijackers and things like that, that are really more of a nuisance than like maybe an info stealer that's trying to steal your data. And so all this to say, depending on where you are is depending on where you're going to see the majority of the threats. So in the SMB world, we see mostly pups and adware. And as you get larger is when you start adding in the 0 days and the more advanced types of attacks. So as we move into this next one, we're going to go through kind of another little case study here. And this really lends itself to the cleaning software type of attack. So, how this started was an employee at a company wanted to rip a song off YouTube. And why they decided to do that, I guess they wanted a copy of the actual MP3 and not just to leverage Spotify or Apple Music or whatever it is. But it's very simple to do. If you just Google like YouTube to MP3, you'll get pages of options. So they copied their link off YouTube and went to this website. And when they did, a pop-up occurred in the side of their browser window, and it looked very legitimate. It had the little gear icon that you see with like your system preferences or system settings in the dock. And it said your Mac is infected with a virus. It even had the little #1 badge to draw your attention. And it said, if you click here, we can help you with this virus. Now, this is very common behavior on macOS. We see it a ton. Cleaning software is the bane of my existence. And it's so popular for people to have these cleaning softwares that say that they're going to do one thing, which is fix your computer, make it faster, clean up any malware, but they do something different. So in this case, the user downloaded this cleaning software, and it acts very legitimate in the sense that it installed a launch daemon to maintain persistence, and that is generally what legitimate software does, which is leverage a launch daemon in the root directory. This one again, and we included 2 of these that actually used AppleScript because it is quite novel for a program to use AppleScript in the sense that it can only target macOS. It's not cross-platform. So it only targeted macOS. And you can see the trend. And we talked about the trends in the MITRE ATT&CK framework earlier, but similar things, connecting to a command and control server, system discovery, pulling data from the system. However, in this case, not only did they just want to collect data, but they wanted to destroy data too. So in that sense, it made the users think that there was indeed something wrong with their device, when in fact, there wasn't even originally. So when we pivot into the MITRE ATT&CK framework yet again, we can see almost the heat map of these types of attacks. And then what could we have done to stop it? So you can see, again, similarities, right? Security awareness training to know what to click on, phishing links and things like that. Patch management into file integrity monitoring. And then, of course, and honestly could be one of the most important pieces is having a backup of your data and some type of plan if something does go wrong.
So Well, we'll take a step back here to kind of what does all this kind of correlate to. So if we think about it, smaller organizations, under-resourced organizations, really what we mean, are particularly at risk. And Stuart kind of talked about that timeline and how fast they were able to get to sensitive data or their ultimate target. In our research, what we found was basically 90% of critical assets had credible attack vectors. So we showed that MITRE attack framework, and sort of the downstream of how you get to it is very, very quick. What was even more concerning is what we saw in cloud environments. And what we saw was that those critical assets lie just one hop away from sort of once they're able to establish a presence inside the network. For on-prem, it was a little bit more difficult. There was actually three subsequent steps for those assets as well. So once they're in, once they've established presence, the ability for them to get to the target is actually relatively easy and doesn't require that many execution steps, which we kind of showed in the MITRE attack framework. And it was kind of supported by the ethical hackers showing how fast they could actually compromise the organization. Funny enough, we actually asked them, it was hard to quantify how fast, or once the ethical boundaries are removed, how much more efficient are you? And it was pretty much, they said, I can't put a number on it, but if I could just do whatever I want, and I don't have any restrictions, it's going to get a lot nastier. So look, y'all have seen this before. The consequences are devastating and all this. The one thing I want to point out up here is it's one thing to have an incident. Everybody hears about these incidents and these gigantic data breach costs that are associated with them. It's another one for it to actually convert into data disclosure. That's the absolute, nightmare scenario. What we found was there is a distinct difference from small and medium organizations to enterprise organizations. So enterprises being 1,000 or more employees. For organizations that had to actually enact an incident response plan for an incident, the conversion rate for enterprises from incident to data disclosure was only 37%. For small and medium businesses under 1,000 employees, as this was categorized, the rate was actually 55%. Now, one caveat that I want to give as well was that when you look at the number of records that are disclosed in these data breaches, we all hear in the news about these, million records and 100,000 records. Those are actually kind of the fringe ones. 29.6% of data breaches are actually 10,000 or records and under, and about 50.7% of data breaches are actually 20,000 of records and under. So it's not these mega breaches, but the consequences are still highly devastating to these organizations. And you can see all the different kinds of implications that come in here. So once an incident happens, the conversion and sort of the consequences are even bigger for small and medium businesses. And we're going to show in this example how consequential this was. And this is a very unique one that actually took place over a longer period of time because the attacker really needed to stay under the radar.
Yeah, this one is really interesting, and I think really speaks to the threat landscape of what's happening on macOS right now. So the cracked application, I guess you can kind of surmise where this is going. But one of the very common attacks right now on macOS is info stealers. So whether that's the Amos info stealer or a pile of the other ones, Cuckoo, there are a lot that are currently targeting macOS. So one of the easiest ways for info stealers or crypto miners to get on the endpoint is to actually attach itself to a piece of software. And the best way to do that, and a very for sure way of getting on the endpoint, is to do it with cracked software or pirated software. So you can think even back to the days of LimeWire and Pirate Bay that this was happening still. But even now, in this case, someone was, let me take a step back really quick. In the last few years, the work from home culture has really grown rapidly. And with that, especially on macOS, came the bring your own device option. So it meant that people could work from home. They could take their home computer, which in some cases was a MacBook, enroll it in their company's MDM, mobile device management software, and do their work from home on their personal machine. So what this meant was people were not only doing work on their device, but they were also doing personal things on their work device. So this person wanted to get better at editing videos, but they didn't want to drop, I think it's $300 for Final Cut Pro. So they went on a pirating site and found a cracked version of Final Cut Pro for free, but with it came this info stealer. So once they downloaded it and installed it, Final Cut, the cracked version, installed properly and what they expected. However, this info stealer started running in the background. And what it did, it installed a cron job in the cron folder. It's still a thing, even on macOS. And what this does, it specifies a specific time and then, in this case, pointed to another binary that the info stealer was using. So every day at a specific time, it would kick off this info stealer, which would run some bash code and search the system and connect to this command control server, send a heartbeat. And it did system discovery over the first couple of days. As we move closer to a week, it started collecting data about this person's business that they were a part of and looking for specific files. And over time, via crypto mining and looking for crypto wallets, it was able to pull in money and divert small amounts of that to their own wallet. And over 2 months, you can see, resulted in significant losses to both this person and the business. So you can really see how something as simple as a cracked application over time can have a huge financial impact. And as we go to the next one, again, you can kind of see the similarities between all of these, whether it's scripting languages like AppleScript or Bash, scheduling some type of persistence mechanism via cron or launch agent or launch daemon. And I think the important part is what happens at the end. And we'll go to the next slide. And I think one of the most important parts is having an incident response plan and having backups of your data. It's so important. We can't stress this enough. But there's a lot of places in here where things could be stopped. And we see kind of the trends here as well. Security awareness training on the front end, helping inform users what to click on, what not to click on, where to raise a red flag to their IT department, and then having an EDR step in throughout this middle part for stopping scripting languages. And if you catch something at any point in this before the actual exfiltration of data starts, you've stopped the threat, and then you can contain it and isolate the host from its network.
Yeah, it's funny, if you heat map a lot of what we've seen from on the MITRE attack framework, you start to notice preferred pathways. And same thing with the actual defensive mechanisms against it. And in fact, we thought we had actually thought about doing that for this presentation, but we wanted to keep it relatively simple. But there are preferred pathways that they take, and like valid accounts, we noticed in almost every single one of them, which is not a surprise there. So we're going to keep going here with the referencing back to that ethical hacking survey that we did. We actually asked them end to end from the endpoint perspective, like how fast can you do the end to end attack? We kind of broke it down into different stages, and they said within ethical boundaries, 57% of them said under 25 hours we're going to accomplish our objectives. Now, here's what we really wanted to know was, how often can organizations essentially detect your movement or whatever, anything in your in your attack chain here? So 77% said rarely, meaning less than 15% of the time or never, were they ever actually detected. Now, detection is one thing, as we all know. It's how stopping them. And what was extremely concerning was 82% said that some or few companies, unfortunately, they didn't put the exact numbers against this, could actually stop them before they could achieve their objectives. Again, this is ethical hacking. So, remove those boundaries. These things are going to get much, much worse. Now, Here's the thing, we all know Mac OS, EDR for Mac OS has been out there for quite some time. But what we've seen in some of our research is not all of them are really created equal. There's a lot of nuances to creating, specific detectors and visibility that are key to making sure they're effective against these different scenarios. And Stuart's going to talk a little bit about how our mindset was and how we approach that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that make an effective macOS EDR, and we'll talk about our implementation of that in a few slides. But in general, let's talk about what can make a good macOS EDR. So, of course, the first thing is visibility. Do you have the granular enough data to actually write good detections? So I think the best way to do that is to actually do what Apple recommends, which is tap into their endpoint security API or framework. And this was only possible in the last handful of years. Before that, it was writing a kernel extension, which was unstable, could cause kernel panics. But now Apple has this API that you can tap into and read messages from that deliver you very granular data. And fortunately, it's a vetting process to actually get a specific entitlement to allow a company to do that. So if I wanted to write my own software that was malicious and could tap into endpoint security, I would need to take it to Apple and request that they give me that entitlement, which they probably wouldn't without a good use case. So from there, we need macOS specific detections. And as we've seen throughout this, the landscape for macOS is very different. What you're looking for is very different. You can't just take a Windows detection and run it on macOS and have it work. There may be a few very specific cases where that is possible, but for the most part, it's going to be a very different threat landscape, so different detections. And that includes threat hunting. So what you're looking for is different. And all these tie together because to threat hunt effectively on macOS, you need macOS experts to be doing it, or people who have a deep knowledge of the macOS ecosystem and the threat landscape. And then lastly, what are you going to do if you find something? And that's containing the threat. So not allowing it to move laterally and continue to infect other devices.
And so if you look at the adoption of, let's just say, all these Mac OS, for EDR actually created equal, you still see very, very low adoptions. Now, we couldn't find any studies that were under 1,000 employees, for these statistical purposes. But what we looked at from an enterprise perspective is only 52% of Mac OS devices are actually protected by EDR. Let's just pretend that they're actually effective to the components that Stuart was talking to. And of the organizations that have EDR, basically 38% have them covering less than half their devices. So it's still a very wide open for attackers to essentially come in and hit these 48% that are not protected. Now, basically, to summarize it, this is a story that you've always heard, and really it comes down to operational constraints. Not enough expertise, too expensive, sends tons of alerts if you're in a DIY situation or even in a managed situation, and too little time. We talked about the time frames in which you basically have to be able to detect them and stop them, even in those examples. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we approach this and how we're essentially helping organizations solve for this. So I'm going to keep this relatively simple because I don't want this to be too much of a plug on what we do. So thinking of those different components Stuart was talking about, one of the big things that we're doing in here is we have had the macOS trained threat hunters. Stuart's going to hit a little bit more on this, but you can see the end-to-end process. We actually purposely built the visibility to see inside the nuances of the macOS operating system. We built specific detections, especially for those different kinds of pups and unique components that Stuart was referring to as well. And then on the threat containment and remediation, looking at, time is of the essence. We look at the whole purpose of MDR as basically minimizing threat actor dwell time. It's a race against time. And so we look at how do we help organizations do that? And we kind of split it into three components. The first one is basically threat containment. We will perform the host isolation on behalf of the client as long as they allow it to. You have the flexibility to do so. This is basically stopping the spread. Day, weekend, night, holiday, it doesn't matter. We're going to basically stop the spread of the actual attack. Now, we don't stop there. We actually do the active remediation. So we eliminate the threat off the technology that we manage or that's in our purview. So this can be file deletion, process termination. We can even reboot systems. But one difference is we give flexibility to our clients, especially for the ability for it to occur automatically. You can opt in for it to occur automatically, or you can actually do it on a click to approve basis. Now, one of the reasons that we do that is because you're not just going to jump in and be like, hey, I just trust you to automatically, remediate all of these components. It's like a doctor. You're not just going to go into some doctor, and be like, yeah, sure, inject me with it, whatever you want. I just completely trust you. Let me make sure that you're actually diagnosing things correct. And by the way, we have a less than 1% false positive rate. So we establish that trust over time, but give you flexibility to actually have the active remediation the way you want it. And then we want to help you with the guided cleanup and recovery, help you to return to normal. Like, what are the hardening recommendations that throughout that attacker chain could have been done? A lot of those things Stuart talked about that we can help to prevent this from originating, send them back to the starting line, or hopefully have them never, ever come back. So I'm going to let Stuart talk a little bit about how our approach across a couple of these things happened, and essentially like why we tried to do something that was a little bit different than what's out there.
Yeah, and this kind of harkens back to what I spoke about last, like doing this right so it's effective. And so we took a lot of time. And one of the questions I saw roll in, and I can actually address it here because I think it's applicable, is platform agnostic EDR agents, not specific to macOS. So what we did in this case is we re-architected our agent to make it platform specific, to make it work with Apple's system extension, to make it tap into Apple's endpoint security framework, which again gave us very low-level visibility, which means we can see events in a stable way, which you couldn't previously. So with that visibility, we're allowed to have very specific detections. So we had a team of dedicated macOS engineers write our agent. We have dedicated macOS detections engineers who are writing specific detections that target macOS. And then a SOC that has been trained in what to look for. So whether it's threat hunting or looking at potential threats, all of those things lead to this very large corpus of macOS experts that know what to look for, know how to find threats, and know what to do when they find one. And this leads to false positive reduction and our aim of keeping false positives below 1%. And lastly, the containment and remediation. So we developed a host isolation feature which leverages a network extension that is designed to lock down the system. And again, this is per Apple's recommendation. And so we followed these things that we felt made our EDR, managed EDR, supreme, made it hard to evade. And detections is always kind of a game of catch up in a lot of ways. So you're trying to both stop threats that are constantly occurring and getting ahead of threats. And you're always trying to play catch up with hackers as their techniques are novel. And our job is to try to beat them to the punch.
All right. That actually brings us to questions. And there was one question in here, Stuart, that might be pertinent to the last point that you made. And it says, have you seen anything break out of the host isolation?
I have not. Again, leveraging the network extension, like with the way that we designed host isolation using the network extension, that again is an Apple API, and it requires an entitlement and things like that. So I have not seen anything break out of our host isolation. There are other ways to do, I would say, pseudo host isolation that I don't believe are as effective. Whether or not I've ever seen anything break out of that, I don't believe so. But again, this is per Apple's recommended way of doing it, and I have not seen anything get around that yet. I can roll through some of these questions because I was kind of watching them come in. Again, to talk about the platform agnostic EDR, I think I spoke to it a little in the sense of I think you need something that is designed for that platform. And that's really hard. So what we have here at Huntress is basically a base agent that can work across platform. However, there are very specific components that are part of that we have a team that develop them specifically for macOS. So you can get a little of that, but I think once the agent gets on the endpoint, there has to be things that are specifically designed to interact with that operating system to make it effective. This one got a few upvotes, so I want to make sure I mention it. Is Microsoft Defender a good EDR for macOS? I don't know about its EDR ability. I know Defender mostly for its AV capabilities. And so we've gotten a handful of questions about Defender and managed AV in general. So to take a step back really quick, Defender on Windows is different than it is on Mac in that you get a free version when you buy a new Windows device. However, Apple's response to that is XProtect. And although XProtect is rapidly getting better, as far as a long-term solution for a business, XProtect really is always working reactively. So they see a threat, their team will write a YAR rule over a couple weeks and then push it out. However, that's tricky when you're trying to stop threats early. So I think as an AV, Defender is superior to what Apple ships just with their devices. And I let me think. As Defender has improved, like I've done tests against Defender's AV and have been impressed with its results. And so I think Defender is a great option for people if they're looking for an AV solution on macOS. And I know the macOS team here is looking at like how best we can do what we've done on Windows, which is manage an AV and Defender specifically. So I do think it's a good AV for macOS. I don't know about its EDR capabilities. Let's see. Another one here. What is the easiest way to detect Illuminati networks or Bright Data VPN proxy software on a Mac? It's not always doesn't always show up in the applications folder. Okay, that's a great question and a very great detections type question. So I think what you are best going to do is looking for the way it persists. It's going to have to persist in order to run when you reboot your machine. So wherever that's persisting, I'm guessing as a launch agent or maybe a launch daemon in the root directory, you can look for its specific name of the P list itself, or even some of the contents. And within there, you can actually see the binary that it's pointing to, which is what it's going to run every time it reboots. And that is the main application binary. So you could also detect on that binary itself. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the applications folder. So you can look for that in that case too. Lastly, I think this is the last question I've seen, at least in the Q&A section. Oh, there might be a new one, but can you recommend something other than Atomic Red Team to leverage to test your organization's EDR software? Whew, that is a hard question. We have been trying to figure that out as well. What a great testing framework is. So I've been talking with the macOS detections engineer here, as well as detection engineering team. And one of my goals here is to build something that is a macOS specific testing framework. I honestly, I don't have a good recommendation other than Atomic Red Team. It's really the de facto one and one of the only available ones for macOS. And I think it is lacking in its verboseness and what you can test against, which is why I've been looking at developing something here at Huntress that can do something similar, but is specific for macOS.
Stuart, there's a couple others in here. If you click on new.
Okay, let me jump over.
Yeah, there's a couple of good ones in here.
Cool. All right. Have you seen rootkits in the macOS world? That's a great question. Not really. Again, the primary landscape is a huge amount of pups and adware and these more, I would say, noisy type of malware. I wouldn't say they are as much rootkits, so I don't believe I have, at least not in the time I've worked on macOS. What if our company uses a combination of Mac and Windows devices? Is your platform able to manage both? So yes is the short question. We have an agent designed for Windows and one designed for Mac OS. It's the same price regardless of which one you use. And if you already use our auto runs for Mac OS, you actually get this EDR portion on top of it. So you just have to update your agents and you get the EDR portion. So the platform is definitely able to handle both. Again, there are nuances in the actual code of the agent and what it's doing and the detections we write. But yes, it's our EDR works on both Windows and Mac OS. You talked earlier about torrenting. I know there's a lot of risk from downloading cracked software, but how about videos? I'm assuming that means cracked videos or like pirated videos. That's a good question. I think when we talk about torrenting, I think it in a lot of ways depends on where you're doing it from. Like I imagine that threat actors are targeting the more common torrenting sites. If you go to a very off the wall pirating movie site, I don't know, but I would guess that a lot of those sites get kickback from adware. So it's if they click on it, if a user clicks on it, then that company gets a little bit of a kickback. And that's how a lot of these like we talked about ripping YouTube videos, that's how a lot of these sites can stay up is by having these little pop-ups that give them a little money. So I don't know explicitly, but I would say with 99.9% confidence that yes, there would be at the very least, there is a risk in downloading a pirated movie as well or video. Do you know of any open source tools that leverage the Apple endpoint security framework? It depends on the goal of what you are trying to do with the endpoint security. So if you're just looking to get visibility into what is happening on your machine, you can use Red Canary released a tool called Mac Monitor, I think a year or two ago, that basically you can install the system extension, install the tool, and you can actually see all the endpoint security events that are coming in on your device. It's a really cool, really handy tool. Apple, for what it's worth, also released a command line tool called ES-Logger. So if you go to your terminal and you type in sudo ES-Logger exec, it'll actually give you all the processes that are executing on your machine. So there is that. If you're looking for like a security type tool that's going to detect and alert, I don't know of any free tools that will do that. Let's see, Wes. I'll probably let you take these two new ones that just popped in, or at least I'll let you field them first, and I can always chime in. But
yeah, when we have an agent for a Linux host, yeah. So that's actually on our it's on our roadmap. We don't have a definitive date, so I can't quite give you details on we've drawn the line here. We absolutely have it on the roadmap. We know that it's something that we need to address, but it's not quite ready for us to publicly talk about yet. Cool. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer on that one.
and a quick question. I saw just a comment I saw in chat. Last I checked, your agent was Microsoft only. When did you start protecting non-Microsoft machines? So that's today. So this is really the kickoff. Is we are now protecting macOS devices. We just went GA recently and started doing some larger testing on current customers that were willing to update. But it's new, and so hence why we're here.
And how do we Hunter stack up against SentinelOne? We actually have on our website comparison against SentinelOne and some of the others out there. So there's some information on that. I will say I know SentinelOne has made significant investments in their Mac OS protection. So I'm not going to sit here and bash them. There's a very different approach, especially. I hate to get into like a cost war, but there's a very distinct difference in sort of the economical value of the approaches against each other without degradation of the detection or response capabilities. I'll just put it that way. And then there's a lot of information on the website where we actually do a comparison against each that'll give you more in depth. And with that, I think that is it. Oh, hold on. I think that was it. All right.
Oh,
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. You'll see a pop up at the bottom for you can see, catch a demo of everything we've talked about today. Feel free to download the handouts as well to give you more information on the Mac OS and how you can, start a trial with us. Feel free to reach out with us. There's a number of ways that we can help you and kind of get started and kind of scrutinize our service. We'd love to be put to the test. So we appreciate your time and, join us for the next.